This is the FYI on Youth Ministry, a youth ministry podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. This season, we have something a little different for you. We're bringing you audio versions of some of our favorite FYI blog posts. So, enjoy hearing a short behind-the-scenes introduction and the article read by the authors. In this episode, we have Jen Bradbury sharing her article, 5 Ways to Cultivate Trust with Teens in Your Ministry. But first, let's hear what young people had to say about today's topic.
Why is trust important between youth leaders and young people?
Young people are not going to invest in a relationship that they think is going to come back and hurt them. And they're not going to put in that time and effort, and they're not going to enjoy being there, and they're not going to be willing to learn if it's coming from people that they don't think that they can trust and that they don't think respect them.
Probably because if you have a youth leader that you know that you can trust, the youth leader is a person who's constant in that teenager's life, and it's important for kids to have consistency and somebody dependable to rely on.
Hey FYI podcast listeners, this is Jen Bradbury. I am the content director here at FYI, and I am also a co-author of our book, Faith Beyond Youth Group. We're here today with all of the co-authors on the book, including...
Hey, I'm Kara Powell.
And Brad Griffin.
And we are here to celebrate the launch of our new book, Faith Beyond Youth Group, and tell you a little bit more about it.
Yes. Woo! Awesome. Woo!
I cannot believe that it's finally out.
Yay!
It's been a long journey.
Yes.
I know it. A year in the making, and even more with the research.
Yes.
And here we are. We are excited for you all to learn about our latest findings. And Kara, can you share what the book is actually about?
Yeah, well, I love the title, Faith Beyond Youth Group, because it's super descriptive for what we hope and pray emerges in young people and faith communities as a result of this research in this book. And so we focused on how to instill in young people character. And I love the definition that we came up with for character. It's living out Jesus's goodness by loving God and our neighbors. And I'll tell you, for youth leaders, if we saw young people doing that, what a difference that would make in how we felt and in our ministries. If young people saw each other living out Jesus's goodness, what would that mean to them in terms of how they view the church and how the church is viewed by the world? And so, we don't want a faith that's only about 90 minutes or 75 minutes in a youth group meeting. We want a faith that is embodied all week long. And that's the heart of this book. And it's super practical. So it's got FYI's trademark deep research turned into practical ideas that a leader could implement this week or this month.
That's really good, Kara. Jen, thinking back to the research, what was an insight that impacted you the most as it emerged?
So, in this research, all that emerged was actually a framework for how to instill character in young people. And we call this the Faith Beyond Youth Group Compass. And for me, both as someone who works at FYI, but also I am a volunteer youth pastor in my local congregation. And ever since we have been writing this book and working on it, I have been implementing these compass points in my own ministry. And they have really helped us as we've worked on cultivating trust and modeling growth and teaching for transformation, as well as practicing together and making meaning. So, Brad, knowing that the Faith Beyond Youth Group Compass was kind of central to the book, I'm curious, what do you hope youth leaders will gain from Faith Beyond Youth Group?
Similar to you, I really think that what we share in the book it's memorable and it's doable. And I think it'll make a difference. So that's what I'm really, really hopeful for, is that leaders will put this compass into practice and that they'll see something different and be encouraged. So that's what I'm really, really hopeful for. So We hope you'll check out the book. You can find out more at faithbeyondyouthgroup.com.
Awesome, Brad. Thanks so much. And friends, we want to leave you with Jen to hear more about one of the Faith Beyond Youth Group compass points, maybe my favorite one, although I'd probably say about all 5 of the compass points. But I sure do think about this compass point a lot, and it's cultivating trust. So Jen, take it away.
So as you heard a second ago, Kara, Brad, and I have a book coming out called Faith Beyond Youth Group. This blog post that we're talking about today is one that I wrote after an experience with my kid, with my oldest daughter, and her choir director, because I saw it so distinctly as a moment that was about cultivating trust. And for me, I saw this happening in real time in front of me, but then I also recognized, oh, this is what happens in youth ministries. And it got real personal because, again, I'm serving as a volunteer youth minister. And what I've realized is that I've often taken liking me to be the same as trusting me, when in fact, those are 2 different elements for teenagers. And so I started seeing the ways in which I've struggled to build trust with the students in my youth ministry over the last 2 years, and thought about it through the lens of what I watched happen between my daughter and her choir director. So Brad, Kara, and I have a book coming out in November. It's called Faith Beyond Youth Group. And in this book, which is based on some research that FYI did on character. So as I was writing this, one of the things that really clicked for me was this element of it feels like we can mistake trust and likability. And in reality, there are some really key differences. And so I ended up creating this list that you'll hear towards the very end of this article of when a student trusts you, you'll hear this, you'll see this. And it was actually really, really enlightening and encouraging for me as I was writing that to recognize that, oh, in these 2 years that I've been in this volunteer role, I have really seen the shift that moves from likability into trust. And these are really some of the marks of that have shown me, oh, I've moved into this different space. And I've been able to recognize that because of my other youth ministry experiences. And so my hope is that that's something that's really resonant, but also helpful with you as you are thinking about your own youth ministry. So now here's the article we've been talking about. It's entitled 5 Ways to Cultivate Trust with Teens in Your Ministry. My daughter Hope loves singing in our community's children's choir. At least she did until 4 months ago, when she went from eagerly attending practices to looking for every opportunity to get out of them. When prodded, she explained that her choir director actively called kids out when they made mistakes, something that gives my introverted daughter actual nightmares. While it's not uncommon for choir directors to correct singers by name, this felt especially harsh for my daughter because the director was brand new. He didn't know Hope yet, and she didn't know him. Despite her growing distaste for choir, Hope attended week after week, and we made it to the end of the year. Barely. Much to our surprise, Hope then decided she might want to return next year, which meant she had to do an end-of-the-year evaluation with her director. After Hope's evaluation, the director asked to talk to my husband and I. He asked about our experience, and we told him how Hope had begun dreading choir because of his tendency to call people out for their mistakes. After hearing this, our normally dynamic and extroverted director went silent. He thought for a minute and wondered if he'd spent too much time rehearsing and not enough time actually getting to know the kids so they could learn to trust one another. As a youth leader, my heart went out to this director. I understand his dilemma. In ministry, we have so few hours a week with young people. It feels critical to use every single moment well. Often, it can be tempting to do exactly what Hope's choir director did. Skip over the less important stuff in order to spend more time on whatever curriculum we're teaching because that's what feels more spiritual. But here's what FYI's latest research on forming faith beyond youth group found. Cultivating trust is every bit as important in the faith formation of young people as teaching for transformation. Both are integral parts of what we call the Faith Beyond Youth Group Compass, which gives us a framework for discipling young people. In some ways, this might seem like a no-brainer to you. It probably makes sense that trust is critical to faith formation. But here's my question for you. Do your students actually trust you? Now, before you answer yes, my students trust me, consider my story. I've been serving as the volunteer youth pastor at my church for the last 2 years. Most of the students in my ministry have genuinely liked me since day one, or at least day 2. Yet they've only begun to trust me in the last 2 or 3 months. What changed? Nothing. And everything. Here's what I mean. I didn't make a grand gesture that magically made teenagers start trusting me 2 months ago. Instead, I just kept showing up, week after week. Every time we gathered, I listened to what young people were saying. I empathized with them. When appropriate, I vulnerably shared pieces of my own story so they could get to know me. Finally, after I showed up consistently for about 20 months, the teenagers in my ministry began to believe I wasn't going anywhere. Trust finally followed. What I discovered, and what our Faith Beyond Youth Group research found, is that trust requires consistency and closeness. We define consistency as relational longevity and closeness as relational proximity. Without consistency and closeness, you can be liked, but you won't necessarily be trusted. Of course, consistency takes time to build, but the good news is there are practical steps you can take to cultivate the relational proximity needed to form trust. Here are 5 things you can do today to start cultivating trust in your ministry. First, show up consistently. If young people have to wonder each week whether or not you're going to be there, they will never trust you. But if you're consistently present, slowly but surely, they'll begin to count on you. This is particularly important in settings where there's been a revolving door of youth leaders. If that's true in your context, you're likely going to have to dig out of a trust deficit with young people. To help with this, model consistent presence yourself. Then ask those who serve alongside you to commit to serving consistently for a designated period of time. To be clear, this doesn't mean that you or they can't ever miss youth group. That's an unrealistic and unhealthy expectation. What it does mean is that you and your leaders need to clearly communicate when you're going to be absent so that students know you didn't just abandon them. The second thing you can do to start cultivating trust is take time for activities that build relationships. Play games, eat together, go places with each other, make memories together, connect teenagers to each other and to your leaders. Don't underestimate the importance of these elements, all of which cultivate trust. What's more, remember that God is in these activities too. And because God is in them, they're no less spiritual than worship, a talk, or the next lesson in your curriculum. The third way to build trust is to ask good questions and listen to how students respond. Listen to what they're saying and to what they're not saying. Remember what's happening in their lives. Then ask them a question about that activity or that event when you see them next. And here's a tip that's worked very well for me. Make yourself a cheat sheet and then look at it before you go to youth group to remember what's going on in the lives of the teenagers that you're serving. The fourth way to cultivate trust in your ministry is to share vulnerably but appropriately so that teenagers can get to know and trust the real you. Trust is mutual. When you trust young people with your story, particularly when you share failure stories, they're far more likely to trust you with theirs. While every teenager knows what failure feels like, Not all young people have tasted success. That said, be careful. Sharing vulnerably doesn't require you to bare your soul to the young people in your ministry. That's what therapy is for. So before you share, consider this question. For whose benefit are you sharing this story? If it's for the benefit of young people, tell your story, but skip the details that your adult friends find amusing. Young people just don't need your TMI. The fifth and final suggestion for cultivating trust in your ministry is to apologize when you make a mistake. Perfection doesn't cultivate trust. Authenticity does. I was reminded of this by my daughter's choir director. After realizing he hadn't spent enough time actually getting to know the kids, Hope's choir director asked if he could talk to her. When he did, he apologized. He owned the fact that he'd prioritized the wrong thing, and then gave her concrete examples of how he'll make rehearsals different next year. As a result of his apology, Hope went from fearing him to trusting him. By the time we got to the car after her evaluation, she was excited to do choir again next year. In the same way, our youth group kids don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be real. And that includes apologizing for our mistakes and then making them right. Now, even when you take these 5 steps to start cultivating trust in your ministry, there's still no magical amount of time after which young people will automatically trust you. Instead, you'll slowly start to see shifts in how teenagers interact with you. When students trust you, they'll tell you about the worst part of their day, not just the best. They'll start texting you randomly instead of randomly responding to your texts. They'll acknowledge you when they see you outside of the church. If they're with their friends, they might even introduce you. They'll stop asking you for advice about their friends and start asking you for advice about their own lives. When students trust you, they'll tell you what's really going on at home and with their friends. They'll show you their real emotions. They'll laugh, but they might also get angry at you or cry. When students trust you, they'll disagree with you, passionately but respectfully. They'll admit when they don't know things because they won't be afraid you'll think less of them. When students trust you, they'll ask you questions they can't ask anyone else. In other words, when students trust you, opportunities for discipleship will abound. So don't skip this important step. Take time to intentionally build trust with young people. Doing so is a critical component of ministry that forms faith beyond youth group.
This podcast is one of the many free resources produced by the Fuller Youth Institute. You can find similar resources at fulleryouthinstitute.org/blog or in your inbox if you sign up for our newsletter. Check out the show notes for links to all the resources mentioned in today's episode. And thanks so much for listening. And here are some final thoughts from young people.
How can youth leaders build trust?
Just like being transparent about like how we're all people. That's something that my old small group leader did. He did a really good job of, we all have things we're going through. So like if anything, I hope that like I can say stuff that you learn from, but also you guys will say things that like I can take something away from, which is good. And I think it really helped our group become like a spot where actual like deep conversations can happen.
I think that's a big, yeah. If you see me as obviously we are not adults, but we're also not like infants with no thoughts and opinions. Like, we have feelings, and we are also human beings who want to be respected and seen as human beings.